Hello and welcome to the first episode of this series. In this series, we are going to learn about Zod, and in the context of a React application using Vite and TypeScript. Zod is used for validating and shaping your data in your front-end applications. First off, I want to tell you that for this course, for this playlist, I am assuming that you are already familiar with React development. If that's not the case, make sure you watch some of my series on my channel. We are not going to, talk about, let's say, React development. In a way that is suitable for people who know nothing about React. So again, you need to be already, familiar with React. And the good news, as I said, is that I've got you covered. So there are, courses on my channel that deal with the fundamental concepts of React development. Make sure you watch them first. And as always, I have prepared the notes for this series. The link to the repository is in the description of this episode and all the other episodes of this series. So you can easily click that link, go to my GitHub page, and kind of clone the repository and explore the code for each episode. We are going to, create a new branch on the repository so that we can better, navigate the code base. On this desktop, I have, VS Code. I have opened the notes for this course, and on my other desktop, as you can see, I have VS Code running with a new, empty React application. So we will be adding, the things that we need to this React application. As you can see, we are, on episode 1 branch. So again, as I said, each episode will have its own dedicated branch. And one other thing that I would like to tell you is that we are going to learn Zod in the context of a real project. So we will, introduce the components, probably pages, schemas, and I will, walk you through the concepts of Zod. You need to be motivated. You need to be, enthusiastic about learning Zod, and of course, as I said, you need to have some prior experience with React, and that's it. If you've got any questions, you can just, drop a comment in the comment section, and I'd be more than happy to get in touch with you guys. Let's get started with the first episode. By the way, this series will probably have like 10 episodes. So throughout the episodes, you will understand what Zod is, and I will show you, the different concepts in action. So the objectives of this first episode, we want to understand what Zod is, why it's useful. We want to set up a project. Of course, I have already created that project in VS Code, and we want to create the first schema and use it. So what is Zod? Zod is a library for validating and shaping data. When I say data, I mean like user input from a form or from an API response. So the data that comes into your application. You might get that data from an API endpoint, or the user could, for example, enter that data via a form. And you want to, as I said, shape and validate the integrity of that data based on a schema that you define. So think of that like a tool that does two different things at once. First, it validates the actual data at runtime, like for example, checking if the value inside of the name property of an object is actually a string value, or if the value for a property called age is a number. And it gives you, at the same time, it gives you TypeScript, the types that you have defined with TypeScript. Zod, let me put it this way, Zod can help you create types in your TypeScript code. So that again helps you with development. Your IDE, your editor like VS Code can use that schema that you defined with Zod to kind of do type checking while you are developing your app. So that again helps you with writing better code, safer code. So again, Zod at runtime, right, checks the data, checks the data in terms of validation, whether the data is valid or not, and when you are writing the code, so during development, helps you with type checking. And I will show you examples of these. So let me again give you a scenario so that you better understand the benefits of using Zod. Let's say you receive this JSON in your front end. So this could, I don't know, like come from your API endpoint, or a user has entered some data in a form. Anyway, you get this data, this JSON data with some, two properties, two values in your front end. But of course, I mean, based on the name, if you take a look, you expect age to be a number, not a string. And here it is a string. So TypeScript won't catch this at runtime because it only works while you are coding. So TypeScript does the type checking when you are actually writing your code. But when the application is running, TypeScript cannot help you with that. That's one of the advantages of using Zod. So with Zod, what you need to do first of all is to define something called a schema. Let's talk about the concept of a schema. Let's first understand what a schema is. So a schema is like a blueprint or a set of rules that you define, and through those rules you kind of establish the shape of your data. So you kind of say that, for example, an object of type employee needs to have these different properties with these different types. If an object violates any one of these rules, of course you're going to have a problem. So your schema will kind of validate the data that you have based on the rules that you define in that schema. So imagine you're building a form, right, where a user can come in and type their name and age. You want to make sure that the value that the user enters for name is a string value, so a piece of text, and age is a number, not like a string representation of a number. So that's what a schema does. A schema allows you, as I said, to describe what's allowed in your data. So to describe the shape of your data. And you define your schemas with Zod. And this is one example of, a schema. So this is, the name of the schema, user schema. Then you're using this Z or Z object coming from Zod dot object. And then here, kind of you define the, schema. So for example, you say that there is this property called name. It has to be of type string. There is another property called age, and it has to be of type number. So this is the way you define the schema, a simple schema. Again, this says that I expect an object with a property called name that is a string and an age that is a number. So when you give Zod some data, the schema is going to kick in to kind of validate that data. It's going to validate the data, is going to make sure that the data matches the blueprint that you have defined in your schema. And if they don't match, it's of course going to throw an error. So again, now that we have defined the schema, I want to again talk about why a schema is helpful. So we have the schema in place. Now suppose we get this piece of data, this JSON object, right, in our front-end app. So that looks okay. By looking at it, it looks fine. You've got two properties, two values for those properties, but 25 in quotes is a string, not a number. But based on the schema, we said that we expect age to be a number. Now, without Zod, your code might break later, not while you're developing it, but later, when it tries to do, for example, math, like age plus 5. With Zod, you will be able to catch the error immediately, and you can fix it before bad data causes bugs. So again, think of a schema like a filter that protects your app by making sure your data is the right shape and type. It is the right shape and type before it is even used. So again, you define a set of rules through your schema, and the data that you receive must follow this schema, these rules. If the data doesn't, follow the rules, you're gonna throw, you're gonna kind of handle that. And I'm gonna show you how you can handle that. For example, you can show some validation messages in the front end of the application. So now, having defined the schema above, Zod will do two things for us in our React application. First, It checks at runtime if the data is valid or not. Second, you get auto completion and type safety at compile time. So again, with the schema, you can define types and you can start using those types while you're developing your application. You can create a type from your schema. So you have your schema in place. You do not need to create like an interface in TypeScript anymore or a type in TypeScript anymore. You can use z.infer, type of, and the schema that you have defined to get the actual type of, that schema. Based on that schema, you get the type, and then using this type, you can start creating your objects. So this line is saying, hey TypeScript, figure out the type of data that user schema is expecting. A property called name of type string, a property called age of type number, and then call it user. And then of course, you can use this type to create objects. This is one of the advantages of using Zod when you're developing a React application. Now let's go deeper. You have already defined this, schema, right? Again, the name is user schema, and you are, defining two properties of type string and number. This means that user schema expects an object like this. Name is of type string, age is of type number. But instead of writing that type manually, like this, for example, in TypeScript with a type or an interface, you can use Zod to create that type based on that schema. As I said, like this. So again, you're using z.infer here, type of the name of the schema, and then you capture that inside of a variable called user. And of course, you can use user now to create user objects. This tells TypeScript to extract the type automatically from Zod schema. Why it's awesome? Again, you don't need to repeat yourself. You do not need to, again, create, the schema and also the type. You don't repeat yourself. You just create the schema and you infer your type based on that schema. So no copy pasting, the same structure. Your types always stay in sync with your schema. Suppose you, change your schema in some way. So that type is gonna, get updated, is gonna reflect those changes in the schema. You just need to make updates in one place only, in the schema, not in the schema and a type. You do not create the type yourself, right? The type is inferred based on the schema. So if you update the schema later, like for example, by adding an email property, the type user will update itself automatically to reflect that update that you have made to the schema. So again, in short, Z or Z infer type of user schema means that give me the TypeScript type that matches this Zod schema that I have defined before, and type user names the type so that you can use it elsewhere in your code. Now I've got a type called user. I can go ahead and create, objects based on that type. Having created that type from the schema, if you try to pass, for example, a string value for age, Zod will throw an error because again, age is not a number. Now, let's talk about why using TypeScript alone without Zod, without schemas, is not enough. So you have created this type in TypeScript, right? We are all familiar with this concept of creating types in TypeScript. So this looks fine, but this only helps while writing your code. Of course, when you are writing your code, TypeScript will catch, let's say, errors that you have made as a programmer. So if you have, for example, assigned a string to this age property while the application is being developed, TypeScript will kick in because it is using this concept of, type checking. It will, tell you that what you are doing is not correct. You cannot assign a string to this age property. Once your app is running, TypeScript vanishes. It doesn't protect you from invalid data, the data that might arrive in your code, in your application from a backend API or, from a user. So if your API sends like this object, TypeScript won't complain, but Zod will. So Zod will do like shape validation, if you will, at runtime, validating the shape of the data that your application receives and wants to work with. So Zod will validate that, And if the data is not in the correct shape, it will throw an error. Now let's, that was like an introduction so that you can, understand a little bit about Zod. But of course, throughout the series, we will talk about the different concepts, and I am going to show you the different features of Zod. As I told you, I have already created that project, that React project, but you can go ahead and create it on your machine, and then I want you to install Zod. So this is the package that we want to use, and there is this piece of code in episode 3, I guess, that is using a specific version of Zod. So I am going to do that. I am going to install that specific version of Zod in my application. So as I again told you, I have created this React application. If I take you to package.json, you see my dependencies. And I do not have Zod here yet, but I am going to install this in my application, and then I will continue with the code. So the version of the Zod that I want to install in the application for now is version 3.25.56. Again, I am going to tell you about the reason why I have decided to go with this version for this tutorial. So again, let me go to my application. I told you I do not have Zod installed, but I am going to install it. So I am going to install Zod version 3.25 and 56, and that's it for now. So I have installed Zod. Now what I want to do is to create some folders. I'm going to create the components folder, the schemas folder, and the pages folder, and we will be adding these little by little throughout the series. First, let's create the first schema. So I told you about schemas. Schemas contain rules based on which you kind of define the shape of the data that your application expects to work with. So if you take a look at this code, I am creating this file called book schema.ts inside of this schemas folder, and I am going to explain everything in full detail. But by just looking at it, you will kind of understand that this schema is defining the structure, the rules for a type, which is going to have 3 properties called title, author, and year. Title and author are of type string, and they need to have at least 1 character, right? And if they don't, if they're empty, this is the error that the application is going to show in the front end. And year is going to be of type number, integer. It needs to be greater than this value, lower than this value. So let me go ahead, define this schema, come back to the notes, and explain everything in full detail. So here I am going to create a folder called schemas, and then a file called book schema.ts. And I am going to write the code for this simple schema. The code itself, I guess, is very self-explanatory. By just looking at it, you kind of understand what it is, what it is all about. But again, to be 100% sure that we understand everything, I want to, go through it line by line. So the first line is the import. So this line imports the Z object from the Zod library. You need the Z object or Z object to create a schemas, like for example, z.string, z.number, and so on. And then you are, exporting something. This is the schema that you are exporting, right? And you are defining your schema here. So this creates a schema, a set of rules for a book object. And you're using this z.object to say, I want an object with some specific fields, like title, author, year, and so on. And now let's break down each line of code inside of the schema and go through them one by one. So the first one is title. As I told you, based on this rule, we are saying that we expect title to be of type string, so this must be a string, and then min 1 title is required. It must have at least 1 character. It cannot be null, it cannot be empty. If it is empty, Zod will show this error message. The next field, the next property of this object is going to be author. Author again is of type string. It must be non-empty. If it is missing, if the value is missing, if it is blank, it's going to show this error message. Last but not least, year. Year is of type number, right? It is of type number. It cannot be a string. Integer, it must be an integer value, not decimals. It is greater than this value, so must be greater or equal to 1900, and lower than or equal to, so must be less than or equal to the current year, which at the time of recording is 2025. So again, using these, we are defining the rules of these three properties of a book object. And if there is a book object that doesn't follow these rules, we are going to show our validation messages. Why this schema is useful? This schema, as I told you, is going to make sure that every book object that you deal with in your application has a non-empty title and author, has a valid year, shows friendly error messages when the data is not valid, validation, checking user input, inference, generating TypeScript types from the schema. I told you that now that we have defined this schema, we can go ahead, create a type based on this schema, and then use that type to create objects. And of course, using this schema, we can do user input checking, user input validation when the application is running. Now, let's try the schema in the app component of our application. Let's take a brief look at the code. I'm going to explain everything in full detail, or at least the things related to Zod, and then we will run the code and see this in action. So again, this is the app component of your application. I have decided to define a simple state. This is an event handler, and I am importing my, by the way, my schema here, and then here I am, creating a validation message. And I am using book schema, the thing that I have imported from above, safe parse data. Take a look at the data. So the data is this. So it's like a book object with title, with author, with year, but year is of type string, not number. So I am validating that using safe parse. I'm going to talk about safe parse in a minute. And if validation.success, I'm going to set my local state to this value. Otherwise, I'm going to set my local state to this value. And then here inside of my template, what I am going to do when the button is clicked, I am going to run that event handler, right? And of course, I am going to show the value of my state here. Now, let me go ahead, write the code for this app component, and we will, talk about it more. So this is the, code that you get by default when you create, an application, a React application, but I am going to create my React app component from scratch. Again, guys, if you want to know more about React development, there are courses on my channel that you can watch. Another thing that I would like to tell you is that I am preparing another playlist for using Zod and React hook form. So, combining these two together to create forms in your React applications and using Zod for, input validation. So make sure, if you're motivated about learning Zod and dive deeper into the concepts of Zod and how it integrates with React hook form, make sure to take a look at that course as well. Let me import this use state as well as my schema, and let me go ahead and understand every single line of code, or at least the pieces that have to do with Zod. First, as I told you, we are importing the schema that we just defined. So this contains a set of rules through which we can kind of validate the book objects, and we are importing use state because we want to create local states in our components. Then here's the app component. So This is going to define our app component. This is the state that we are creating. It is of type string. It doesn't have any initial values. Then we've got the handle check button function. Inside of this, we are creating a sample book object, right? This could be a valid number. We can enter an invalid number to check whether the schema works or not. And book schema.saveParse, I guess this is the most important thing here for us. This uses Zod to validate the data object against your rules. So you're using saveParse to validate the data. Why are we using saveParse? Always remember, using saveParse, if the data you are validating is valid, you are going to get this object in return. An object whose success property is going to be true. And if the data is invalid, again, you're going to get an object whose success property or key has the value false. So you check whether the validation passed or not. If it is valid, display the book data. Otherwise, display the error message that Zod produces. And then we are going to create the template, of course. We are going to show the value of our component, of our state here. And we are going to invoke that, event handler using this button. This is what gets rendered on the page: a heading, a button, and a pre-tag. Now let's go ahead and run the application. So this is the app running. I am using Vite, so I have run the application using npm run dev. I'm going to close my terminal. This is the button that is being rendered in my app component, and when I click on this, I will get this message, this error. So it is basically saying that the year property needs to have a value which is of type number, expected is number, but it has received a value of type string. And then we've got the message, expected number received something, right? But if I come here and if I change this and refresh the application, validate book, it says valid book. We get the title, we get the author, and we get the year. So very simple validation on an object that could arrive here from a backend API or from our user input. And then we've got the save parse for validation, and then we are checking the success key or property of what the save parse returns. What happens when you click the button? The sample book is passed to the save parse function. Zod is going to check the object against the rules is title, a non-empty string is author, a non-empty string is year, a valid integer between 1900 and the current year. If yes, then the object is completely valid. Let's go ahead and show it. Otherwise, let's show the errors. Why are we using save parse? There are two main reasons and two main ways actually to validate objects in Zod: parse and save parse. So the name kind of tells you why we're using save parse. Parse is going to throw an error if the data is invalid, so that can crash your app. But save parse is never going to crash. It gives a result that you can check. You can check the success flag, whether you've got a true value in there or a false value. That's why save parse is safer for real apps. Now run the app. I have already done this, right? Using npm run dev, and check that in your browser. Now, what I want to do as the last part of this episode is to run some unit tests for the schema. I am a big fan of unit testing. I like to unit test everything, both in the front end and in the back end. And I've got, videos on unit testing. You can, for example, refer to my playlist about unit testing in React if you're interested. And I've got unit testing covered in the back end as well. Now that we have, created a schema, why not write a unit test for this schema? I'm going to create this file, book schema.test.ts. Next to the schema file itself, I'm going to install vtest, and then I am going to write a simple test for the schema to kind of check whether the schema is handling the rules correctly or not. So what we have done here, right, is a kind of testing. But of course, it is not a best practice to do your testing in your app component. It is better to have a dedicated file for unit tests and feed different objects into your schema and check whether the schema and the safe parse is going to correctly validate that object or not. So again, if you're not familiar with unit testing in React, there is this playlist that I have created. You can watch the videos, and I think that'll help you tremendously to learn about unit testing. But basically here, as you can see, I have created 2 unit tests. The first one is going to feed a valid object into the schema. So a title, a non-empty string title, a non-empty string for author, and a valid year. And then it's going to check whether result.success is true or not. And the result is the thing that safe parse is returning. So we're capturing that inside of a result variable. And then inside of that, there is this key called success, and I am going to check the value of that. The next one, the next unit test, is going to pass an invalid book object into the safe parse, capturing the result and then checking whether result.success is false or not. So let me go ahead and do that. First, let's go ahead and create this book schema.test.ts. So here I've got this book.schema.test, and I am going to change the name. I am going to install my dependency on vtest for unit testing. Now let me go ahead and write the unit test. If you want to learn more about unit testing, just watch the series that I have created on the topic of unit testing. So let's go ahead and pass a valid book object to the safe parse and then check the result. And then another test for passing an invalid book object to the safe parse function and then checking the output. Now the next thing for us, now that we have created our tests, is to use npx vtest to run our tests or add a script inside of our package.json, because this would be kind of the only place where I am creating a unit test. I am going to use npx vtest, but again, there's nothing stopping me from adding a script to my package.json. Again, this course is not about unit testing. If you want to know more about unit testing, watch that other playlist. This course is going to be about Zod. But I thought to myself that as the last part of the first episode, I would like to add a simple unit test for this simple, schema. Now, let's go ahead and run npx. What was the command? npx vtest. And as you can see here, I've got 1 test file, 2 tests, and both of them are passing. And if I, for example, come here and change this to a string, right, I do not expect to have a true value in there, and that is the reason why the tests are failing. So I have 1 test file, 1 failed test, 1 pass test, and of course I am going to revert my changes. And that's it. So why do I suggest that you use Zod from day one when you are developing a React app? This is the last point of this episode. So using Zod early on allows you to catch user mistakes before they break the application. They allow you to reuse the same schema both in the front end and in the back end, so that you kind of protect your application both in the front end and in the back end against invalid data. And again, it helps TypeScript with the shape of your data, and it allows you to validate the data. So if you're interested in learning more about, for example, form validation with Zod, I've got this other playlist on the channel about using Zod and React hook form. So I highly recommend that course as well. Make sure you check it out. And yeah, that was it. That was it for the first episode. I hope you've enjoyed watching this episode. I hope you continue watching the next episodes in this playlist, because we're gonna explore Zod in more detail. We are going to see different features, develop the app one step at a time, and you're gonna learn a lot. Thank you so much again for sticking till the very end. If you enjoyed watching this episode, don't forget to give the video a like, share it with a friend, and stay tuned. See you in the next one. Bye-bye.